All right. Joining me is Kristin Smith, president of Solana Policy Institute, which is a nonprofit organization that obviously advocates for the Solana network and also DeFi more broadly. And I would say the best way to think about Kristin's role is she serves as a liaison between policymakers and Solana and the DeFi ecosystem overall. She helps in the creation of legislation and regulation that helps promote its growth here in the US. And so, Kristin, it is a pleasure. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Nate. Excited to have this conversation.
Okay, so I gave that very quick description of Solana Policy Institute and your role. But to start, I would love to have you tell us a little bit more about both the organization and what you do for people who are unfamiliar.
Yeah, no, well, you did a great job introducing Solana Policy Institute. We're just a little over a year old. It's a kind of a relatively new model for Washington. You know, typically when you think of industry advocates, you have trade associations or you have companies in-house. Like Coinbase, for example, has a big lobbying team and policy team. But for public permissionless blockchains that are these decentralized ecosystems, we realized there was sort of a gap in the way that those were addressed. And so with Solana being the fastest, most used blockchain in the world, it seemed a year ago that there should be an organization that is ensuring that the interests of this type of ecosystem are adequately represented in Washington. And so we're a small team based in DC. We work on regulatory issues, obviously a lot of legislative discussions are happening right now. We would engage in the courts, when that is needed. And so it's a lot of fun, and it really builds on the work I did previously as the CEO of the Blockchain Association, just more specific to the Solana ecosystem.
So given the name Solana Policy Institute, I would assume you're most focused on helping Solana grow and thrive. But I'm curious how you view the competitive dynamics in the industry overall, in that there are a lot of competing blockchains. And so do you approach your job with sort of a rising tide raises all boats mentality, or is there more of a competitive aspect to this where you're clearly trying to help Solana get ahead of these other blockchains? Is it both? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's certainly a rising tide lifts all boats. I mean, I think if we look at the crypto landscape in the United States over the past, 4 or 5, even more years, the regulatory landscape has not been particularly clear, and that's caused a lot of problems for different centralized players within crypto, for DeFi, for the layer 1 blockchains, for sort of any part of the subsector of the ecosystem, and the industry has had issues with regulation. And so the work that we do helps, all public permissionless blockchains out there, and sort of our centralized counterparts like exchanges and trading firms, et cetera, that would also benefit from more clarity. So I think it is a rising tide that lifts all boats. I do think there are some differentiators though. Like if we look at Solana, Solana is a very fast, very inexpensive, very, very much highly used blockchain. And, if you talk to people who are building on top of the Solana network and creating services, one of the things that we want to do within Solana is become the home of internet capital markets. So we can be the financial rails for payments, for equity markets, for derivative markets, for credit markets. Any kind of asset can be issued on top of Solana and traded on Solana. And so when we look at our agenda at Solana Policy Institute, we think, okay, so tokenization of real world assets is really important. We want to make sure we're working with the SEC and the CFTC to pave the way for innovation exemptions to happen, for example, that would allow for that. So given that, the crypto industry is so complex today, it's way different than when I started on this back in 2018. It's gotten a lot more intricate. There are a lot of different, sort of specialties. We want to, there's a lot of work to do. And I think what's really great about Washington is we don't look at other industry players as competitors. We look at them as allies, as part of a coalition. And so we work really well, across the crypto ecosystem when it comes to pushing our priorities forward, but we do make sure that we are addressing the issues that are most important for Solana.
All right, before we get into a variety of crypto topics I have for you, you mentioned that you were previously CEO of Blockchain Association. And I have to mention, in looking at your bio, this is very impressive. So if you don't mind, I'm going to rattle off a few highlights here. So you've been featured on Fortune's 40 Under 40 list. You've been on CoinDesk's 50 People Who Define the Year in Crypto, Cointelegraph's Top 100 Influencers in Crypto and Blockchain. Let's see, you were featured as one of the Hill's top lobbyists, one of the most influential people in tech titans in the Washingtonian. You're making me feel like I need to work a little bit harder in my career. But I guess, how did you end up at this intersection of crypto and regulation and lobbying?
Yeah, no, I mean, I look back on my life and realize that the most important decision I've ever made is to get into this space, because it's been, great for me personally, but also just like so satisfying to be a part of something bigger that's trying to do good in the world. And I think that, I started working on Capitol Hill. I was a staffer for a couple different members of Congress for about 10 years. And then I sort of got, I worked a lot on internet policy back at the time. And this was kind of as Web 1 was moving into Web 2. And I didn't really like Web 2. I didn't like these big centralized companies. So I sort of got discouraged by that, and I actually tried to leave Washington. I went to business school. I tried to get out of politics entirely, and it turns out, despite all my best efforts, my valuable skills were still only in Washington. And so, as I entered the lobbying world, which is often what somebody who works in government will go advise people on how to influence government. That's a very, very common career path in Washington. As I was entering the lobbying world, I realized that I didn't really have a good pitch. Like, I didn't know about something, I wasn't an expert in something. I didn't have particularly like special, unique relationships within government. But when I learned about Bitcoin, I realized, wow, nobody's talking about this. And I cared so passionately about it. And it reminded me a lot of the work I was doing in the early days on internet policy on Capitol Hill. And so to me, it was kind of being in the right place at the right time. And I don't think when I started this that I would realize that, blockchain and crypto would go from this, pretty like obscure kind of niche issue to work on in Washington to really one of the most powerful industry forces, in the city. I mean, it's just been remarkable to see the rise of this industry and to be a part of that, and to have it go from just a handful of kind of odd people working on this to, just a professional army of lawyers and lobbyists and communications professionals. And it's been really fun to watch the evolution of it. And it's, it's one of the reasons why I think we're at this like critical moment where we can, we've seen so many victories in 2025 and in the start of 2026. And I think, we're going to continue to see progress on both the legislative and regulatory front, because we have that advocacy infrastructure in place that didn't exist when I started back in 2018.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue here, because I agree. I think we're at a critical moment for the industry. And when I think about the intersection of crypto and regulation and everything that you do, I have to imagine the Clarity Act is the biggest topic of conversation right now. Is that fair?
Yes, it is 95% of the conversations in Washington right now. I mean, there are other great things going on, but this is the big focus because it is such a critical moment for this legislation, and all the pieces are there. We just need to make sure they come together and get the bill across the finish line.
And so, yeah, from your perspective, where do things stand on this right now? Maybe for people who haven't been tracking every single update on this or don't have the background, if you want to offer a little background, that's probably helpful, but also just where you think everything stands.
Yeah, well, I'll say, if you're not familiar with the Clarity Act, there were sort of two big legislative issues that Congress needed to address. One of them was stablecoin policy. That's the Genius Act that was signed into law by President Trump last summer. I think that has been really fantastic in opening up, sort of the world of crypto and blockchain to institutions and banks and payments companies. And we're seeing a lot of activity that is deriving as a result of having certainty over how stablecoin issuers are regulated in the US. The other big piece that is out there is market structure. So, this is, what we would hope to be a durable framework that protects consumers, that fosters innovation, that gives builders certainty by knowing, who the regulators are and what the regulatory requirements are. I know that's silly, but if you look at over the past 4 or 5 years, there were big battles going on between the SEC and the CFTC and the industry, and there were lawsuits and litigation, and there was no real clear pathway if you were trying to issue a token, or if you wanted to trade a token, or if you wanted to raise money with a token. There were no rules for how to do that. And so the reason it's called the Clarity Act is because it gives this type of certainty, this type of clarity that the industry has been asking for and wanting. So this is not a deregulatory bill. This is very much putting the rules in place and clarifying any existing rules that might already apply. So it's a really important piece that we want to see get done. And as you know, Nate, Congresses are 2-year terms. Last year, in the beginning of this current Congress, the House moved rather quickly and proceeded to get their version of the Clarity Act through the committees and through the House, and sent it over to the Senate. The Senate being what it is, there's only 100, and in the Senate, one senator has a lot more power than a single senator or single member of the House. It's taken the Senate quite some time to get their version of the legislation together. Part of that is because the House had much more experience with market structure legislation. They took a pass in the last Congress with Fit 21. And so they were more familiar with the issues. That the Senate had a lot of catch up to do on the education front. But they also had some different ideas on how to approach it, et cetera. So the good news is, there are 2 different committees of jurisdiction that have to work on this legislation. So the Senate Agriculture Committee has already passed their version or their portion of the bill through its committee. But the Senate Banking Committee has really taken some time to get this right. And we're very encouraged that all signs, at least as of the time we're talking, indicate that we should see a Senate Banking Committee level markup. This is where, they consider the bill, they consider amendments, and then they finally vote on it and then pass it on to the floor. I think if we can get the bill through the committee, and hopefully in a bipartisan way, then there's still plenty of time left this year for that bill to be combined with the Senate Agriculture bill and then sent to the full floor for a vote. You do need 60 votes in the Senate because you have to overcome a filibuster. It's often common, you'll hear about these big omnibus bills where they put a bunch of issues together. That's not really a viable pathway for crypto legislation, because in order to attach like say we wanted to attach market structure to the defense authorization bill or the farm bill or some other, kind of must pass legislation, what you would have to do is get the sign off from the committee chairs involved. And that would include Elizabeth Warren, who is a ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. She's not going to let crypto legislation move forward because she's been very hostile towards crypto. So we need those 60 votes, which means this has to be a bipartisan product. And so in the Senate, that has caused a lot of conversations. And because we do need to make sure that it's not just a majority of Republicans that vote for this, but also a good number of Democrats as well. So that has been a very long update as to where everything stands. But, we're making progress, and hopefully we'll be able to get this bill moved through the Senate Banking Committee and onto the floor of the Senate this summer, so that we can have another bill signing ceremony with Donald Trump at the White House. And then it'll be, I think, off to the races for new investors to come into the crypto space, but also, I think more importantly, for the traditional financial institutions to start integrating the technology, into their services and see that convergence that we've been talking about between TradFi and DeFi for so long now.
So are you ultimately optimistic that this will get done? And I guess I'll add to that, Kristin, we have upcoming midterm elections. Does that play a role at all just in the Senate pushing to get things done here. And the other aspect of this that I think about is, do you want to be the candidate that is holding this up, especially if it's for reasons not necessarily to get this right? It's just maybe you are a little bit anti-crypto, because I believe I saw a stat somewhere that like 20% of voters say they care about crypto as an issue. Like, this has become very important to people. And so do you want to be perceived as the candidate who has been anti-crypto?
Yeah, well, let me answer both of those questions. First, I'm optimistic that this can get done. All of the pieces are there. There has been so much time and effort by so many members of Congress, members of the Senate. The White House has been involved. The political pressure is there. The industry is strong and sophisticated. All of the pieces are there to get this done. It is not a guarantee that this gets done. Legislation is really, really, really hard, and a lot of things need to come together in just the right way. And there are several issues right now that are still being negotiated. And, it is very, very difficult to do these things. That being said, I'm optimistic. I'm feeling pretty good about it. I am the most optimistic I've been, just because I've seen such progress. And I think that the language of the bill, as we understand it, is in a really good spot. So I am optimistic. I do think that the midterm election plays a role in this. Last cycle in 2024, crypto really found its political voice. We had advocates across the country that were organized and were, showing up at campaign rallies, and that were writing their members of Congress and really making their voice heard on crypto issues. We also had the crypto voter, which you referenced, and you might say, oh, only 20% of people care about crypto. Well, that's actually like quite a bit if you're in a really competitive race and you're trying to find an edge one way or another. If you're in a congressional district and you're only a couple thousand votes away from winning or losing, you want to have that edge. And I think you pointed out something really important, like there's no upside to being anti-crypto. There's no anti-crypto lobby out there. Yes, there's like Elizabeth Warren, and there are a few people in government that kind of complain about it, but there isn't this sort of political force that crypto has. I would also say the crypto industry, got involved with campaigns from a financial perspective in a meaningful way from the first time. And so that, catches the attention of candidates who have to raise, millions, if not tens of millions, or in some cases even hundreds of millions of dollars these days for some of these really competitive Senate races. They're looking to find, like allies that can help support their races. So I think when you combine, the advocates, the voters, the organized crypto industry, it is a political force in the election. And I think that what we saw in the House is, there was uncertainty when the Genius Act and the Clarity Act went to vote in the full House. We were doing sort of whip counts. You can kind of tend to rely on Republicans to vote for this, mostly, not entirely, but it's kind of the Democrats in particular that, are sort of on the fence. And what we saw on both of those votes in the House is that the number of Democrats that we thought were going to vote for it was, maybe like one or two dozen, and then it ended up being, several dozen in either instance. And so I think when push comes to shove, people want to be for regulation, they want to be for innovation, and that, we have the votes. The votes are there. We just need to bring them together at the right time and get this bill done.
Okay, and you were alluding to this a little bit earlier, but let's say this does get done and the Clarity Act passes. How does that change things for the crypto industry? And I would say the Solana ecosystem specifically. Like, can you offer some context on that?
Yeah. No, I think it does sort of two things, and that we sort of talked about earlier. One, I think there are a lot of investors that are interested in crypto, that want to invest in crypto, but they've seen the headlines with the litigation back and forth between the SEC and others, or maybe they have internal rules or restrictions that are preventing them from participating in these markets. But I think it will pave the way for more institutional investment into crypto assets like Solana, like Bitcoin. It'll make it okay to do. We're starting to see a lot of that through the ETFs. But I think there is interest out there in investing in these assets. So I think we'll see that. But more importantly, I think we're going to see an upgrade of the way we run our global financial system, right? Like we will see new issuers issue their tokens on blockchains, and we will be able to see these traded on blockchains. They'll be able to be traded 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They'll be able to have very low costs for doing this. And when you bring the cost down and you make it more sort of globally accessible, you have smaller businesses that can potentially go public on chain, for example. You have investors that might not be able to access some type of asset because there's a $500,000 investor minimum, that all of a sudden, because the costs are lower, maybe it's only $5,000 and they're able to participate in markets that were unavailable. So I think we see like a total expansion of capital markets across the board as a result of the integration. And so I think that's super exciting. But and if we don't have Wall Street is highly regulated, right? Like they are used to having a lot of rules, and, crypto has had some rules, but a lot of them have been unclear. And so I think by having the rules and knowing what you can do and what you can't do is going to be a game changer for the entire sector. And it's going to be a game changer for the US, kind of re-emerging as the leader in this space, because I do think we lost ground over that during the last administration when we had Gary Gensler as chair of the SEC.
To your second point there, assuming the Clarity Act does get to the finish line, is that where the crypto industry's focus then turns to, sort of this upgrade of the financial system? Because I just take a step back and think about this. The industry will have this market structure bill. Obviously, as you alluded to earlier, there's already been stablecoin legislation with the Genius Act. We know regulators such as the SEC and CFTC, they're now much more supportive. And so it feels like the crypto industry will have everything it needs to move forward. Is that how you think about it? Like what's the next big area of emphasis?
Yes. No, I mean, I think the legislation is a really big piece of it. Now, the one thing about legislation is that it does take time to implement, because a lot of what the legislation does is it directs agencies to conduct rulemakings. Rulemakings are a very, long process where there's agency proposes text, the public can comment, there's a back and forth process before those go final. So, there will be a lot of work that has to be undertaken to implement market structure, but it will definitely make it safe for innovators to build here in the US. I mean, what we saw before, a lot of this innovation is somebody typing code on a laptop, right? And you can put your laptop in your suitcase and fly overseas and do that work just as well over there. And so we saw that happen quite a bit, and companies were advised by their lawyers to stay out of the US because of the uncertainty. And so we want to encourage that to be back here, at least from my perspective, because we're very US focused. I think as a result, we'll see regulators around the globe, follow the lead of the US and make sure that, they are aligned with where our regulatory framework ends up.
In terms of the regulators, are you surprised at how much the regulatory environment around crypto has changed over, say, the past 2 or 3 years? That we're even discussing a crypto market structure bill, and we do have stablecoin legislation, and the industry is clearly moving forward. You've been involved here, as you mentioned, for a while. So, how different are things today versus a few years ago?
It couldn't be more different. And when, we were painted into a corner as an industry, and, Gary Gensler at the SEC alone filed over 100 lawsuits against different crypto companies. And we're not talking like the FTXs of the world. He skipped them. We're talking, Coinbase, Kraken. We're talking Uniswap. We're talking all of the companies that were, trying to do the right thing, that were engaged, that had lawyers, that were attempting to talk to government. It was incredibly hostile. And there was, the moments where I was like, what have I done with my life? Like, I picked the wrong horse here. Like, this industry is screwed. And you add on top of that, the debanking of the industry, like that happened in what appeared to be a very systemic way. I mean, it was really, really terrible. And then, credit to President Trump for coming in and saying, nope, we want to have this here. And he put folks like Mike Seelig, who is now chair of the SEC, of the CFTC, and Paul Atkins, who's chair of the SEC. He put these folks in place that know what they're doing, that are using authority they already have today to provide clarity. And then when the Clarity Act itself passes, they'll be able to build on that and implement that. And so I think it really helps to have the right people at the agencies. It also helps that there is a specific focus at the White House. I mean, if you had told me these things, a couple years ago when we were, dealing with just a day after day attack from different parts of the government, I mean, I would have laughed at you that something like a turnaround like this could happen so quickly. So, but, I think it shows that, this really is a technology that has value. It's something that, will improve, I think, a lot of lives as it gets more and more adopted. I think it's already improved a lot of lives, particularly around the globe. But it's real. It's happening, and I couldn't be happier to see this, change of events that has happened and to witness it and be a part of it. But I could tell you, I certainly never could have imagined anything as good as we have now.
All right. So I agree. Clearly night and day on the regulatory side with what we've seen out of crypto. What about on the political side? You talk to politicians, and I'm curious, have you seen politicians become much better educated on crypto over, say, the same time frame, the past 2 or 3 years?
Yes, I think we've seen a huge change. And some of it is, you have to have people armed to have the conversations with politicians, right? So, you need to have, there needs to be tools out there if you're a user or a builder and you want to go to a local town hall campaign event. Today you can go to Stand with Crypto and they've got all the updates on the information you need to be informed for those conversations. It takes, folks like the Solana Policy Institute, the Blockchain Association, the kind of professional level lobbyists that can go have those conversations with those who are already elected. And so, a lot of it is you just need to have all of those pieces in place. Like if there's no one there to have the conversations, they're not happening. And so I do think that, most politicians add this as maybe not their top 3 issue, but as they're looking at their economic policy, crypto is often, included as a part of that, because there's such a role for Congress and the government to play at this time. And so yes, we're seeing much greater awareness, and I think it's not like we need every single member of Congress to, have a PhD in computer science with a subspecialty in blockchains, right? Like we don't need that. What we need is for them to be willing to listen and to learn and to be open that this is a technology that could be an important part of our system going forward. And so, I think that there are a lot of avenues for those conversations to happen now that just simply didn't exist even back in the 2022 election cycle.
Okay, so clear progress from regulators, clear progress out of politicians. What about traditional financial institutions? And the way that I'll frame this for you, you mentioned the ETFs before. We know about the adoption there. I think clearly we've seen a lot of institutional adoption of crypto in general, but I'll frame this the other way in that while crypto offers clear benefits to TradFi, in my opinion, is, there's always going to be a group that feels threatened by innovation and change. And we both know there are intermediaries out there who could be cut out longer term, as you mentioned, as we see this upgrade of the financial system. And there are other rent seekers that I think stand to be cut out of the equation. So how does that play into the work you do in helping TradFi institutions understand the importance of crypto, and how much pushback do you see there?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, one thing we do at Solana Policy Institute is we have a lot of experience talking with politicians who don't know much about blockchains. And so we often try to take that same kind of expertise and engage with, the traditional financial world. And we did a great event in New York last month that brought together about 250 folks from Wall Street and connected them with policymakers and talked about the progress. We're doing another one Chicago around the Morningstar conference. But I think there's a real, especially with sort of the larger banks, there's a real interest in figuring out how this integrates. I think asset issuers are beginning to experiment with issuing assets. I think we're going to need a little bit more regulatory clarity before the everyday trading of securities or derivatives is going to be more mainstream. But as we just discussed, all of that is underway. So I've shifted a difference just in terms of the events that we get invited to participate in are much more sort of Wall Street focused, and it's not I think people went from you can't be at a large financial institution and not have thoughts or plans on how to integrate with blockchains. And you may not have the full picture yet, and you might be in the learning phase, but people are thinking about it. And yes, I do think, some of these intermediaries in the long run might not be needed, but we may also see that some of these intermediaries, their role may evolve. Think of a transfer agent, they might be the one that is, responsible for, knowing the identity of everyone and sort of whitelisting, wallets and things of that. So I think it will be an evolution. And as I talked about before, I think it's going to be a total expansion of the market. I think that we are going to have more investors and more businesses that have access to capital markets than we have had in the past, just because the cost and the efficiency is low. And we'll have a global audience that might be able to participate as well, where they don't, have easy access to, say the U.S. equities market, for example. So I think there is more opportunity there. I think with any technology, there will be, a reshuffling and evolution and an advancement. But it is not as if the, financial services industry is no longer going to exist. I think they're just going to, be more efficient, be more lower cost, be more competitive. But that should lead, I think, to more productivity and a larger market.
All right. I know we have just a few minutes left here. Before I let you go, I have to ask you about crypto prices. And don't worry, I'm not going to have you make any sort of prognostications. But as I'm sure you're well aware, crypto prices are in the midst of a fairly substantial downturn. And I'm just curious, does that make your job any more difficult? Is it harder for you to garner support from regulators and politicians and TradFi, or does that not really matter in your experience?
Yeah, and it actually doesn't really matter as much. I think that, users in the crypto ecosystem, builders, in some cases, even the holders of the assets, they take a very long-term view for the most part. Maybe not your occasional day trader, but everyone else is looking at this from a long-term perspective. I think policymakers are also looking, very long-term. They want this to be a place where the U.S. is competitive, and we have not seen the downturn in prices impact that. I do think, that I'm hoping that as the legislation happens, that certainty will, provide kind of a stability for prices going forward, and that we'll be able to see sort of growth and not these wide fluctuations. But yeah, I'm not an expert on prices. I think if I were, I've been doing this long enough that I'd be retired, and I am not retired. So but I think that it doesn't impact the regulatory or legislative process whatsoever. I think it really sort of underscores the need for having a framework in place where markets are fair and the technology is able to take off. And that's what I'm focused on. And I think when we get that in place, then I can step back and I'll try to figure out what are all of the various factors that go into driving these prices. But no, we're making tremendous progress in Washington, and it's really great to see how serious currently the senators, but also the House and the White House and the regulators are taking this.
Well, I'll just say I certainly appreciate all the work you're doing for the industry. really enjoyed this conversation. We'll have to touch base, hopefully, after the Clarity Act passes.
Yes.
At some point.
Hopefully sometime this summer. Fingers crossed.
But excellent insight. Thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Nate.
That was Kristin Smith, president of Solana Policy Institute. Thank you for listening to or watching Crypto Prime. As always, you can stay up to date on all of my latest guests by visiting CryptoPrimePodcast.com. See you again next week.
Crypto Prime is hosted by Nate Geraci, president of OTR Media LLC. Nate is also president of investment advisory firm Nova Diaz Wealth Management. While OTR Media and Nova Diaz are related by common ownership, they are separate and distinct entities, and anything discussed on this program should not be construed as an official statement by Nova Diaz. Some guests appearing on this program may also be financial sponsors of Crypto Prime. This program is for informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice. Investing in crypto assets involves substantial risk, including the possible loss of principal. Any past performance figures discussed are not necessarily indicative of future results. Visit CryptoPrimePodcast.com for more information.